Okay, we will be getting started in just a few seconds. I'm just going to give our attendees a little bit of time to get settled. Okay, I think we can get started now. I think people will start filtering into the room. But before we officially turn things over, I just wanted to say welcome. My name is Anna Maria Delcol, and I'm the marketing manager here at the University of Toronto Press. So just a couple of items that we wanted to cover before we get started. First, and this is great news, we've had an overwhelming response to this launch event. And so we are over capacity in Zoom. And so some people will be bumped from Zoom to the YouTube live stream. So we will do our best throughout the event to monitor comments and questions that are coming in via both Zoom and YouTube. So if you're with us on Zoom, towards the end of this hour-long event, we're going to have a question and answer period. So you can feel free to use the question and answer function at the bottom of your screen to type in any questions for the panelists. If you're on YouTube, you can use the comment field there. We will be monitoring both. And also, before we get started, I wanted to do a land acknowledgement. So we wish to acknowledge the land on which the University of Toronto Press operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still home to many Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. So I'm going to now turn things over to Suzanne Rancourt, who is our Manager of Humanities Acquisitions. Over to you, Suzanne.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is Suzanne Rancourt. I'm the Manager of Humanities Acquisitions at University of Toronto Press. I have the privilege of publishing books in medieval and Renaissance studies and the honor of representing the Lettura Boccacci series at UTP. Before I introduce today's panelists, I would be remiss if I did not acknowledge the important role that the late Ron Schoeffel played in the development of the Italian Studies series at University of Toronto Press. Ron was the inspiration and driving force behind our Italian list and one of the architects of the Boccaccio series. I know that many of his authors and collaborators are joining us today. Let me begin by briefly introducing each of our panelists. Christina Olson is Associate Professor in Italian and Italian Program Coordinator in the Department of Modern and Classical Languages at George Mason University. She is the current president of the American Boccaccio Association. She is the author of Courtesy Lost, Dante, Boccaccio, and the Literature of History. For Audible, she wrote and recorded an audiobook, Books That Matter, the Decameron, that reads the Decameron in light of the COVID-19 pandemic. Michael Sherberg is former president of the American Boccaccio Association and chair of the Department of Romance, Languages, and Literatures at Washington University. His research focuses on Italian literature of the 14th and 16th centuries with occasional forays into the 19th. He is the author of The Governance of Friendship, Law and Gender in the Decameron, and has written on everyone from Dante and Boccaccio to Ariosto and Tasso. He is the editor of the Decameron Fourth Day in Perspective. David Loomis is the co-editor, co-director of the Center for Italian Studies and the Devers Family Program in Dante Studies at the University of Notre Dame. He has published extensively on Giovanni Boccaccio and 14th century Italian literature, including The City of Poetry, Imagining the Civic Role of the Poet in 14th Century Italy, and a co-edited collection with Martin Eisner, A Boccaccian Renaissance, essays on the early modern impact of Giovanni Boccaccio and his works. He is the editor of the Decameron Sixth Day in Perspective. William Robbins is president of Victoria University and associate professor of English and Medieval Studies at the University of Toronto. His research focuses on late antiquity, the Middle Ages, and the Italian Renaissance, tracking the circulation of Latin, Italian, and English literary texts as they are transmitted and transformed across textual communities. His publications include 2 edited collections, Textual Cultures of Medieval Italy and Sacred and Profane in Chaucer and Late Medieval Literature, as well as a critical edition of Antonio Pucci's Cantare della Reina d'Oriente. He is the editor of the Decameron 8th Day in Perspective. These are our panelists. I would now like to invite Christina Olson to tell us something about the history of the series.
Thank you so much, Suzanne. And I would like to start by thanking the University of Toronto Press on behalf of the American Boccaccio Association, and specifically Suzanne Rancourt for her steadfast support of this series over many decades, as I will explain in just a few moments. And thank you all for being here, and many thanks to the 3 editors who are present, Michael, David, and Will, and to the many other editors and contributors who are here today. So the Lectura Boccacci series is something that harkens back to an idea that was proposed by John Ahern, Professor Emeritus of Italian at Vassar College, back in 1983. And for this bit of historical information, I will share my screen with you so that you can all see the original newsletter in which this development was reported. Here we have the newsletter of the American Boccaccio Association from fall of 1983, when Alyssa Weaver of the University of Chicago was president, and Angelo Mazzocco from Mount Holyoke College was the acting vice president. It was at this period in time, too, as you could see, that we had regional representatives for the American Boccaccio Association, which is evidence that I wanted to indicate of the vivacity of Boccaccio studies in that period, and which continues today. So if you can see here at the bottom of the first page, not only is there news of Professor John Ahern's recent appointment to the office of Vice President of the American Boccaccio Association, but also there is the announcement that a special committee that had been formed to evaluate plans for this ABBA-sponsored, so an association-sponsored Lectura Boccacci, had met not once but twice in Italy, during that past summer, and they all supported John Ahern's proposal that had been first circulated in the newsletter of 1983, with the slight proviso that they wanted to increase the number of lectura per year and to shorten the time required for the publication of each volume. And then this matter was voted upon positively in favor at the following ABA business meeting in New York. So this is quite an ambitious proposal, as you can see here. And what's so interesting about this document is how it speaks to the fact that the Lectura Boccacci series originates in the desire to show the how vibrant Boccaccio studies was at the time within North America, and also to give the Decameron its place, to give it its due respect within the scholarship and within the publics that were reading Boccaccio's scholarship at that time, by placing it on something of equal footing with Dante's Divine Comedy, as you can see here in the first paragraph. Compared to scholarship on Dante's Comedy, scholarship on the Decameron is in its infancy. And then there is a summary of the bibliography for publications between 1939 and 1979, showing that many of the stories of the Decameron haven't received serious critical attention, not only in English or in another language, but also in Italian. Now, Ahern cites the founding of the Studi sul Boccaccio by Vittore Branca in 1963 as the beginning of this new era in which there is an increase of attention to single novelle. But then, as you can see at the end of this paragraph, Ahern notes how there is a blossoming, right, of Boccaccio scholarship in the North American continent within the past 20 years, between 1943 and 1963, which is in part, the reason why the American Boccaccio Association came to be founded. Now, Ahern's proposal ambitiously involves the organization of a series of public readings of all 100 stories, as well as the Cornice, that would then be, published in the 10 consecutive volumes. Now, this is an ambition that, unfortunately, for very practical reasons, could not actually be borne out within the history of this series. But as you can see, the proposal continues that the speaker would be charged to present in the span of an hour a lively, original, and detailed reading of part of the Decameron to a broad academic audience. And then the published form of the readings would obviously be more amply documented and so forth. So the idea is that the enterprise would attract not only scholars within Boccaccio studies, right, but intelligent readers of Boccaccio, as Ahern writes, academic or not, undergraduates, graduate students, medievalists, Italianists, and Boccaccio specialists, so that these volumes would become indispensable and of steady sales to college and university libraries, as well as public libraries, both here and abroad. Now, the timetable that is suggested is not necessarily, again, the one that occurred within history. I'll draw your attention to the second to last paragraph. So assuming 3 lecturae annually and 11 lecturae in each volume, that is also including the introduction, the first day would be completed by spring 1988 and could appear in print sometime in 1989, and so forth. So now, again, I'll stop sharing here. This is in a very ambitious time frame. And in a way, it's good that the Lectura Boccacci series took as much time as it did, because it has been able over many years to incorporate different generations of Boccaccio scholars, and as well to reflect the developments within different critical methodologies and practices. So day 1, which I am holding here, came out in 2004. This is edited by Alyssa Weaver. Day 3, edited by the late Piero Massimo Forni with Francesco Ciabattoni, came out in 2014. And I'll just note that this was dedicated to the late Ron Shuffle. And then we fast forward to 2020, in which we have not 1, but 2 volumes that came out, as we'll be hearing about today. Day 4, edited by Michael Sherberg, and the beautiful, equally beautiful, I should say, Day 8, which was edited by William Robbins. So again, I would like to, on behalf of the ABA, thank the University of Toronto Press for having always supported and sponsored this long-reaching and long-ranging project over many decades. In recent years, this series has taken, a new velocity, and you'll be seeing many of these volumes coming out within the next 3 to 4 years. And we really have to thank Suzanne Rancourt for her support of this project. So thank you, Suzanne.
Thank you for your kind words, Christina. We are delighted to be involved with this project and look forward to publishing volumes in the next few years. Now I'd like to turn the floor over to the volume editors, beginning with Michael Sherberg. Michael, tell us what happens in day 4.
Well, readers of the Decameron know, thank you, Suzanne. Readers of the Decameron know that day 4 is a great day of the Decameron. It's a crisis day in many ways. People in crisis, dealing with the crises in their lives, but also it's a crisis moment of crisis for the author of the Decameron, who feels compelled to defend himself against attacks that he reports on. We can have a conversation some other time about whether he made up these attacks or not. I frankly think he did, but never mind that. And so there's a lot going on here. I was happy to edit day 4 because one of my favorite days of the Decameron, actually, as I was editing it, I thought it may have been a mistake for me to choose this day, because I feel so close to these stories that I wondered whether I would become snarky with my contributors and disagree with them about their various readings of the stories. But in fact, I loved the contributions that I got from everyone. I'm struck by Christina's reporting that John Ahern had proposed that the readers propose lively, original, and detailed readings. And I'm happy to report that that's what we have in the collection that I edited. The readings are lively, detailed, and original. What's interesting about the readings, I think, is that even, and I'm sure the other editors can speak to this as well, even though the day has a theme, has a sort of a preset theme agreed to by the group, the stories, the readings and their approaches sometimes meditate on the way in which the theme plays out in the story, but sometimes they move away from the theme, because there are so many different ways to read each of these stories that if you pull a thread, you can suddenly find an original through line that you didn't necessarily see on your first reading. And so what I find so striking here is frankly how originals all of these readings are in the way that they look at any of these stories in a very fresh way. And I'll give you just a couple of examples. We are privileged to have a reading from Christina Olson in our Day 4 volume. She offered a reading of the wonderful story of Elisabetta da Messina, which is the 5th story of the day, a very important story of Day 5. And toward the end of her reading, she did a couple of pages on what is a fondaco, which is a word that sort of appears in passing in the story and doesn't seem to, at first glance, to be enormously important, but all of a sudden it becomes important. And this is what I think is so kind of striking about the Decameron in so many ways, and that I think that these readings actually exemplify, which is that it is, and this is why I love it, probably the most generous book I've ever read, in the sense that if you open the Decameron and you say to the Decameron, what can you tell me about X? The Decameron will say, well, here's what I can tell you about X, because it's there. And it always seems to be there. So every time you go scratching the Decameron, looking for something, pursuing an idea, thinking about something new, the Decameron will have a way to help you along. It returns constantly on the investment that we make as readers. And I find that to be just a remarkable, wonderful aspect to this magnificent text. I don't want to run on for too long. I know that we're supposed to talk about the difference between North American and European approaches. I think that one of the blessings of the American school is, for starters, our familiarity with and openness to a lot of different critical approaches. And I think that we find them in the pages of these readings. And I think that that's something that distinguishes us as kind of a school of Boccaccio scholars that may set us apart from at least our Italian counterparts. We're also supposed to talk about the resurgence of interest in the Decameron. One of the things I was struck by is the fact that when Elisa edited Volume 1, she really tapped the luminaries of Boccaccio studies in the United States at that moment. She found 10 top-rate scholars who contributed, actually 11, essays to the first volume. And now we have 90 more, because there's been such a spread of interest in the Decameron across this country. And even before the pandemic, even before the Decameron became sort of like the book to read in a pandemic, the Decameron was an enormously interesting book to a lot of people. And Boccaccio studies, even beyond the Decameron, has grown rapidly in the United States. And I think that what we see, the importance of these readings, is that they sort of represent the polyphony of the voices, not because they all sound alike, but because they're all singing about the same texts, and singing the praises of this astonishing author who never ceases to fascinate all of us as we read him. And I think I'll just stop there and recommend my volume to everybody who's interested.
Thank you, Michael. And now we turn to day 6. And David, introduce us to this day.
So thank you, Suzanne, and everyone for being here. No, day 6, is one of the most taught days in the Decameron because the stories are so short. I mean, it's anthologized all over the place. In Italy, it's a part of the curriculum. Other stories are as well, but I think day 6 has this appearance of being incredibly accessible just because, stories are a page and a half long in a paperback book. And so it seems like it's real straightforward, but I think day 6 also has some really interesting moments in the frame narrative, where the servants get in an argument kind of about a prickly topic that's gender oriented, and at the end of day 6 they start going to a new space to tell stories. And so it's a pivotal day in the Decameron. They kind of start over after the crisis that Michael was speaking about in day 4, which they try to resolve in day 5, but doesn't really work. And so they begin again, and they start telling stories about how to get out of trouble with quick-witted remarks. And I'm really happy. I mean, I think some of the books, the day 6 volumes, I was one of the things I was worried about was, is this going to be a really short book? Is it going to? But it's actually not. I think it's pretty standard along in terms of length. Putting together the group of really extraordinary readers who wrote the lecturae. I was really happy to see that in the end that not everybody is a Boccaccio scholar, right? Or they are in one way or another, but that's maybe not how they would self-identify in a scholarly group. There's Dante scholars, people who work primarily on philosophy and literature, Petrarch, the relationship between the English and the Italian Middle Ages, music and literature, law and literature. So I'm really happy with how that kind of diversity sort of manifested itself as people sent in calls for papers and so on for the volume. So I'm really pleased about that. There's young, early career scholars and very senior scholars as well. So I think you get a variety of perspectives. Some of the things that come across that really haven't come across before, and because it's such a day that's been so sort of standardized in the way in which we are supposed to think about it. I think the level of engagement by Boccaccio with not only with his earlier works, but with the Bible, with the works of Dante, with the realities of the social structures embodied by medieval law. I think I was really pleased with the way that these readers, and I'll call them readers instead of writers, expanded on the world around the stories that we're reading. So yeah, and in terms of North America and Europe, I think I just echo some of the things that Michael said. Anglophone and Francophone scholars have typically been more open to theoretical questions linked to gender and social class, but also narrative technique. Narratology really came about in relation to the Decameron in terms of Todorov's work. And well, in Italy, as we've seen in the study of Dante, there's been a kind of narrowing down or a kind of inward-looking historicist philology. It's not always the case, but I think if you want to think in big terms, I think the Anglophone approach to the Decameron really highlights its openness and its accommodation to multiple interpretive techniques. And this came out in 2013. the anniversary. And so I just to echo what Michael said, you know, it's the Decameron is one of world literature's most accommodating and inclusive books. You know, it's based on an idea of multiplicity and diversity, and I think the Day 6 volume really highlights that notion. And why is it popular? Like, why is it still popular? I think there's a huge level of energy that I was really not expecting, that among the scholars of Boccaccio and readers of Boccaccio after 2013, the 700th anniversary of Boccacio's birth. And so I think that, you know, that's a part of it, is that there's a whole lot of academic energy. But it's all, you know, with the plague and the pandemic, I mean, I think people are always willing to look at a book that shows humanity finding itself again after a disaster and find itself through storytelling. But, you know, it's a book with a lot of entertaining stories that can also just remain entertaining. And so if that's what we want, we can get that out of it too. So I think I'll hand the microphone over to you, Suzanne, and to Will. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Will, bring us home with Day 8.
Well, thanks, Suzanne. Yeah, this was a really fun volume to put together. I mean, to be working with such a wonderful group of creative, insightful colleagues was really amazing. And of course, studying the artistry and the impact of the Decameron, this is a great joy. It feels like a privilege. As Michael said, this is capacious and generous work. As David said, it's incredibly inclusive. It's a really privilege to just be working so closely on these stories. And also just to watch the project come together, to offer really powerful new ways to think about Boccaccio's storytelling. This has been a real thrill. The word from that 1983 proposal, Christina, that I picked up on was indispensable. I don't know if we've made them indispensable, but it feels like we've made a real advance. So Day 8 is dedicated to stories about practical jokes. And some of the stories are very short and simple, almost puerile, but there are others which are quite long, including the longest in the Decameron, often with practical jokes, the victim turning the tables on the perpetrator. So the Day is a kind of anthology or encyclopedia of the genre of the Beffa, practical jokes presented as short stories. And in this way, it fulfills the 3 days that begin with David's Day 6, right? With the kind of displays of wit. In Day 6, it's verbal displays of wit. Day 7 and 8, kind of displays of wit in action. So because the tales traffic in something that's so popular, even plebeian or even ephemeral as practical jokes, they've mostly received very, very little scholarly attention. Vittore Branca influentially said that these stories in Day 8 more or less derive from local municipal anecdotes. So stories Boccaccio heard on the streets of Florence. And by saying that, Branca implied that Boccaccio is not really grappling seriously with literary issues or with pressing social and political concerns in Day 8. And so the volume contains essays that really take issue with that assessment, really contest it, and show that Boccaccio's reshaping literary genres in interesting ways and showing how these tales are actually addressing the dynamics of civic engagement in 14th century Florence. So as a whole, these essays on Day 8 show that, you know, through the kind of rough and tumble of practical jokes, Boccaccio is developing a very self-conscious literary representation of the Florentine social imaginary. And so this was really quite wonderful to see this kind of new understanding of Day 8 coming together through the dialogue among the different contributions. With respect to the kind of North American energy in Boccaccio's studies, I would just add to what Michael and David has said, that we benefit from a really direct connection with Anglophone historians working on late medieval and Renaissance Florence. There's a long tradition of really excellent scholarship that really feeds into the socio-political readings that we're able to do to Boccaccio in a very, very direct way. And I really want to thank all of those historians who make our work a lot easier. In terms of the multiple voices that are in play in this volume, I would agree with David that one of the great things about the Lectura Boccacci is not just you get people from different theoretical vantage points, but also people at different stages in their career. So we have some newly minted PhDs and assistant professors on the one hand, and also very, very established scholars on the other, all in dialogue with each other. And it's very, very exciting because of that. And in terms of the interest in Boccaccio now, the pandemic has brought back Boccaccio in powerful ways, and certainly it's making me reread Boccaccio in a completely different way. I now read the opening sentence of the Decameron in a much more serious and powerful way, right? It is a human quality to have compassion for the suffering of others. All of a sudden, the Decameron means something very, very much deeper to me. So, you know, as I said, this was a super fun volume to put together. It was a thrilling project to be part of, still is. I want to thank everyone at the University of Toronto Press, especially those responsible for the beautiful jacket cover. Oh, we can't see because I have it behind me. And I really need to thank Jeff Espy. He didn't contribute one of the volumes, but he helped me with so many aspects of the editing and the writing. And of course, I want to thank all of the contributors for being so timely and so responsive and so for generous with their really stellar work. So Kenneth, Maggie, Justin, Catherine, Leah, Rhiannon, Teo, Olivia, Elisa, and Roberta, thank you very much for making this such a fun project to be part of. So Suzanne, back over to you.
Thank you very much, Will. I want to ask the first question of our panelists. What new insight came to you as you worked through this volume? What was the big surprise? What were you not expecting to engage with when you started pulling your volumes together? Anyone?
Okay, I'll try. Well, for starters, day 4 is typically read through the prism of the introduction, in which the author tells a story himself, partial story as he calls it, and defends himself against his attackers. And then 3 sort of stories that form the skeleton of the day, which are the first, the fifth, and the ninth. And so you've got this wonderful symmetrical arrangement. But what I found so interesting was that, and so there's been a great deal of critical attention paid to these parts of day 4. But then what I discovered as I started looking at the readings that pertain to the other stories of the day is how much material there is in the stories that we tend to sort of gloss over when we're teaching a text like the Decameron, because we're so focused on the stories that have risen to the top of the critical pile, because you can't teach the Decameron and teach every story in detail. So you choose certain representative stories and you zoom in on those. There's a wealth of fascinating material in the other stories as well, and I think that one of the advantages of this kind of an approach is that it allows a scholar to dig deep into a story, sort of focusing on that narrative unit, independent or in conjunction with, as I said before, the sort of the larger kind of narrative framework of the text, and see what's there. And often there's a great deal there that's very interesting in and of itself. And it says something about, Boccaccio's own seriousness as a storyteller, I think, that he's not wasting time. He doesn't have an idea, this is a more important story and I need to be more serious in my thinking about how to construct it. He's serious about everything that he's doing. Every story matters to him. And as you read them, you can see that he's put a great deal of creative energy and thought into each one of these stories. And it's sort of a tribute to him and his talent and commitment to us as a storyteller that he does this with stories that even, as David was saying, some of them are a page long in the other days. And yet they are enormously rich.
I can jump in and second that. And what I wasn't expecting, what I was worried, I can see what I was worried about. It's like, is this going to make sense as a book, right? Is it just going to be a series of essays? But it did, because I think one of the things I wasn't expecting, and I was a little bit worried about, like I said, with is this just going to be a really short book? And I think what all of the essays do well is show the intensity of Boccaccio's interrogation into his own society, whether it's a literary society, a legal or a social, or the questions of gender relations and things like that. He's, even if it's just a page long, if you start to unpack that, it just, you see everything that you see, the workshop and the thought process that goes into creating those tightly knit tales. And so, that's, I wasn't really expecting it to hold together, because we're taught sort of, if you teach the Decameron, you got to skip some stories because it's an immense world. And, even some of the tales that we're used to treating as throwaway stories or, filler are incredibly rich. And, that was really, I wasn't too surprised, but I think I was pleased to see that the readers were able to really highlight its richness in that way.
The lectura format certainly elevates those novellas that haven't received critical attention, including 6 of the tales in day 8 have never had a single article written about them. So all of a sudden, it's like, let's pay attention to them. And by focusing on the artistry and the seriousness, we start seeing, so many of the contributors started seeing how Aristotle was in play, or how different aspects of contemporary Florentine governance were in play, or how parody was being used. And so the essays really do speak to each other in that way. It's interesting because the format of a kind of a close reading of a single story provides a uniformity, a uniform vehicle that in some ways hides the diverse, it enables, but also hides the diversity of approaches that are there. And so it allows for many ways for the essays to implicitly speak to each other because of the way that the Lectura Boccacci format is structured simply. So I agree with Michael and David, all sorts of interesting connections, especially with those minor tales.
We have one question from the audience that I will pose to the panelists. It's from Kenneth Clark. Congratulations to all the editors for their marvelous work. The tradition of Lectura Dantis, of readings of individual cantos of the comedy, typically laments that such a narrow focus often breaks the narrative flow of the poem. As editors of these lecturae, what insights have become available in terms of the structure of the Decameron, of its micro and macro narrative? Any thoughts?
I'm happy to jump in if you want. I mean, I remember some conversations at conferences as the ABA was ramping up the process of getting these volumes edited and published. And is it a bad thing? I mean, I think it's got limitations, but it does highlight those. It gives us an opportunity to highlight those less important tales. So I think that's a huge payoff. I mean, I wrote a lectura for another volume, and it was one of those ones that nothing had ever been written about. So it was just uniformly skipped over by the critical tradition. So I think that's great. And I think in the day 6 volume, one of the things that the lectura has provided is it really shows the interconnectedness with the rest of the Decameron. Because I think they were all the contributors were all conscious of the relationship between the tale they were working on and everything else. So it does show, I guess, not the narrative, maybe break the narrative flow. But I think it does show, like you said, something about the way in which each tale engages with ideas that emerge in other tales, and so maybe revise them or show a kind of interaction between different members of the Brigata, for example.
If I could chime in here for a moment, I think that what comes out, the different insights about the macro structure of the Decameron, to answer Kenneth's question too, a lot of those insights can be found in the very robust introductions that are provided by the editors to each one of their volumes, in which, editors generally take into deep consideration, what is the function of this day within the entire structure of the Decameron, and will analyze the theme, to great detail. I would definitely encourage people who are interested in the frame within the macro structure to look to those introductions. But I'll also sort of add informally that, within the circles of Boccaccio studies, there are a few scholars such as Susanna Barcella and Simone Marchesi who believe that sort of the natural product of the series, once the series is out, once all 10 volumes are out, that's certainly a volume that deals with the cornice as a whole, to sort of have that type of consideration of the macro structure be informed by the single stories is something that would also be of great use. So just to let you know that is something that is in discussion, but certainly the insights to the macro structure can be found within the introductions, but certainly the individual contributions as well will, vacillate, obviously, in a good way between, the micro level of the story and then the macro level of the day in which the tale is found, and then the Decameron itself.
There are certainly some approaches to the Decameron that are a bit foreclosed by this format. For instance, the role of the different narrators. I mean, how different it would be if we had a volume of all of the stories told by Elisa and all of the stories told by Neifile, right? Certainly by Dioneo. So that would be a different way of breaking things up, and might see some interesting connections there. So that's a little bit foreclosed, except in the introductions. But I think that the Decameron is much more forgiving than the Divine Comedy in terms of the narrative structure that's in play for bringing it all together. It is a kind of multum in parvo kind of situation we have, not in parvo, multum in something very big. But so I think that the text is very forgiving, and so hopefully it will be of use to people who will have those other concerns as well.
I would just add that we can't lose sight of the sort of the political motives of the whole series, its political origins as a sort of a counter statement to the way that Dante studies had in so many ways dominated medieval studies in Italian for a long time, and the assertion of the quality of North American scholarship and the value of reading the Decameron story by story. I think that those are both political choices that are implicit in a design plan like this. And so the microstructures in some ways do get privileged over the macrostructures. That's just a choice, I think, that is inevitable in a series like this. And I don't think it's a bad thing. What you see actually historically, even at the time that this series was conceived, is that there were single readings of different stories of the Decameron, right? You can find them in bibliographies today. People like Guido Almanzi or Cesare Segre or a lot of other scholars were publishing essays on single stories in which they offered a type of analysis that was dear to them. There was the idea of, let's be democratic here and offer readings of all the stories, I think, is one of the real virtues of this kind of an approach, in the sense that it doesn't repeat the kind of method that we see hither and yon in historically, which is, I'm going to pick this story out of the Decameron and write a really good essay on it. Instead, we're going to let all the stories of the Decameron speak. And I think there's great value in that kind of an approach. I think it's borne out in the results.
Sorry, if I could also add something I had neglected to mention at the beginning too, is that one of the unspoken rules of this series that isn't found in Ahern's proposal is that there can't be a repeat contributor. So 100 tales means, and there are a few, I believe that we have an extra one for day 10, though I could be for the conclusione, I could be, and there's also an extra one for day 4. That means finding more than 100 unique contributors. And again, this allowed us to, I mean, talking about the democratic impulse of the series, this also, meant that when the association was ramping up the production of these different volumes, that we had to sort of really quickly reach out to a wide swath of scholars, not only within Boccaccio studies, but as David was saying earlier, scholars who don't self-identify primarily as Boccaccisti. And so that's really, I mean, I think that there are a few series that can boast, this number of unique contributors, but it enriches the diversity and the multiplicity of voices and perspectives within it.
I have another question from the audience. Is the coherence of individual stories different from the coherence of the days? Sometimes one thinks that a story is plausibly inserted in its day, but could just as well fit somewhere else. How does Boccaccio reconcile cohesion and diversity? Is each day a symphony or a theme and variations?
Well, I'll take that. I mean, I think the approach of Lectura Boccaccio is the theme and variations part, and certainly working on the practical jokes in day 8 which actually has probably more cohesion than some of the other days, because even Dioneo tells a story that fits the theme, right? So it's nevertheless it's so structured around surprise. It's a surprise of what happens in the story in each of the practical jokes when people get surprised, but also the reading experience is one of continuous surprise. So, I mean, it's a great question, Cormac. If we can figure that one out, I think we can all hang up our pencils. But I think certainly for the volume that we had, I think it was a bit more themes and variations, I'd say.
Though if you look at day 4, just to pick up on what Will was saying, day 4, the theme is tales of unhappy love. So all the stories on sort of heartbreakingly, and so you have the kind of unity in that, but then you have diversity, for example, you have chronological diversity. So we have stories set in the past as well as stories set in the present. We have diversity of class, which is a very important factor in the story. You have love among the aristocracy, and you have love, between two young people who are working in the wool industry in Florence. One of whom is a carter. So, the sort of the most menial jobs in the burgeoning wool industry in Florence. So you have this. So the diversity is there, built sort of under this dome of the unity of the theme, and it introduces a very interesting dynamic for the reading of any of the days.
Yeah, it's a tough question. I agree that if we had the answer to that question, then we'd have the golden ticket, I guess. I think the coherence of the individual stories is very different from the coherence of the days. I think the days can be coherent from multiple different perspectives. For example, I mean, in day 6, if we wanted to, if the reader wanted to, could approach every single tale from the perspective of gender and social class-based relations, because that's what the introduction to the day kind of invites us to do, right? And because there's the servants fighting amongst themselves, one of the Brigata members is the judge of this argument and gets to decide. But the question is, whether or not women get married as virgins or not, despite what they say. And so, there's all kinds of perspective. There's a way in, right? But it's not necessarily a privileged way into the interpretation of the unity of the day itself, right? Because another way of looking at it as well is most of these stories, since they're so short, since they're all about the importance of words, can they're all sort of self-reflexive about language in one way or another. And so language and meaning and what have you. So there are different ways in which the days can be considered coherent, right? I think. Well, I think the stories themselves have a pretty, even the longer one at the end that you yourself wrote the essay on, has a kind of structure, has a kind of approach that makes it something in and of itself, as well as being a part of the whole. Thank you.
Thank you. As we draw to the end of our session, I wonder if the panelists would like to offer some final words about their volumes or the series or the future of Boccaccio studies, or the importance of storytelling in the present moment.
I'll say something that's been sort of nagging at me as we've been talking through the hour, and it goes back to Christina's brief history of the series, which is at the time that the series was conceived, there were some very important monographs on the Decameron coming out. Joy Potter wrote a book. Penny Marcus published a book on the Decameron. Margaret Cotino Jones published a book on the Decameron, almost all contemporaneously. And I bring this up because women scholars were suddenly working very hard on the Decameron in the late 70s and early 80s. And I think that in many ways, that Boccaccio studies had become a sort of almost a safe space for women medievalists in Italian, as opposed to the rough and tumble of the world of Dante, which is, I think, a harder world to kind of gain a footing in. And I would like to think that this series has not just opened up the world of the Decameron to us, but sort of created a setting in which a lot of different voices from male readers and female readers with their different perspectives and their different energies have been able to come together in productive dialogue around a text that insists on its importance and its awareness of the needs of women readers, which I think is something that male readers need to keep in mind whenever they're reading the Decameron. This is not a book for us, and we're not supposed to actually be reading it. It's not for us. And so I would just conclude with that I think that Boccaccio Studies has really led the charge in many ways in sort of helping advance scholarship by women Italianists in the United States, and I would like to recognize that.
Yeah, and I'll just sort of echo and thank Michael for those points about the field in general, is that we do seek to be as inclusive as possible, but also to create spaces and venues in which scholars who traditionally feel that they are not privileged by the academy in certain formats feel that they can share their work, right, and be given the same respect as anyone else. And I think that a part of the format of the LB series too led to this. So having the different lecturae happen at different academic conferences, as we saw in Ahern's proposal, a tradition that has, continued, meant that, Boccaccisti were, forming these collective groups and audiences in many different places and venues, and that helped with the cohesiveness and the inclusivity of our community as a whole. It is a very inclusive community, and it is still just as vibrant as Ahern was saying. Back in 1983, you read these words and we think, now, as Suzanne is saying in the chat, we have a virtual Brigada series for the ABA. We just started our online paleography seminar for North American students to get in contact with it, to learn Boccaccio paleography from Italian scholars. And so we have a great community here that is forming connections back with Italy and with the scholars who are active there. And it's an international association with many people represented here today, Cormac and Kenneth and Gaida and others that I see present. So I don't see any sign of it abating, the enthusiasm or the high numbers.
I would say that it might be that the next direction for this energy to go is to really capitalize on Boccaccio's the cultural traffic across the Mediterranean that he's involved in, and across different cultures. So, I mean, we talk about Italian culture, but you know, the final tale in Day 8 is set in Sicily, which is all big confluence of cultures. His time in Naples would have been also a time of great awareness of all sorts of trade routes in the Mediterranean, and so to capitalize on that, and also on the prolific translations, adaptations, filmic adaptations of Boccaccio, in order to reach out to even wider sets of scholars who bring in different areas of expertise, different areas of lived experience. I think that we're really well poised for that. And I mean, a lot of that work is starting already, and it's really great to see.
Yeah, I agree with you. Well, I think that the Decameron, as well as being a place where women scholars and gender studies and things like that could flourish, right? And not just, but also I think it was really welcoming to me as a younger scholar that I didn't feel like I had to some way prove myself. It was a very welcoming kind of field as a graduate student and as a early career researcher. I was able to come to these conferences and feel a part of things, even though there was no real reason why it would have been, right? And I think that's an important aspect of this as a subfield. But it's also, I think all three of our books show how interdisciplinary Boccaccio is, as a potential subject to link literature up with social history, economic history, legal history, the Mediterranean world, like you were saying, Will. I think, and I think I was at another Zoom a couple of days ago, and I think there's going to be a conference on the medieval Mediterranean, and I think at Fordham, and I think Boccaccio can be at the center of that in a way that I think the other two crowns probably wouldn't easily be. So yeah, I think this interdisciplinary aspect of our field, it's welcoming of different voices is something to be praised. I think our books all show that.
That's great. Thank you, everyone. I'm conscious that time is winding down. So just very briefly, Suzanne, I've seen in the chat a couple of people have asked about future volumes in the series or the future of the series. Do you have any comments on where it's going?
We are endeavoring to get books out as quickly as possible. We have Susanna Barcella and Simona Marchesi on day 9, I believe, coming in spring 2022, and other volumes coming into review shortly. So you will hear more from us next year this time, and at every conference and venue that we can celebrate the publication of this book and celebrate the series. So I personally want to thank all of the editors for their kind words and their work and dedication to bringing these volumes to the press. We are delighted to be the publisher of record.
Excellent. Yes, and thank you to all of our panelists today. Thank you to all of our attendees. Just a brief note, there will be a YouTube recording of this event that will be made available. So if you've registered for the event, you will get the link in your email. So look out for that. So again, thank you to all of our panelists. Thank you for everyone who attended. And congratulations to the editors on these 3 new volumes in the series.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.